Hello mortals, I am the BookTube Goddess, the #1 drag queen booktuber on YouTube. One of the books that I read for the Reindeer Readathon was Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, which is his latest novel in the Stormlight Archives, which is Sanderson's
magnum opus.
The series began with The Way of Kings, published 10 years ago in 2010, followed by Words of Radiance in 2014, and then Oathbringer in 2017, and now Rhythm of War brings us to book 4. Now, apparently, and I found this out by one of my commenters, this is planned to be a series of 5 books. So there's only going to be one more book left, which will probably be published 2 to 3 years from now. And Sanderson then plans to write another 5-book series with another story arc as the second part in the Stormlight Archives. Wow. So we are in for the long haul on this one, folks. I'm going to talk about this series in general and then talk about Rhythm of War in particular, especially about the writing, the characters, the magic system, and the world building. But first, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. The bare bones of the plot of the entire storyline is that some cataclysm has occurred at some point in the past on the world of Roshar. By the way, cataclysms in the far past is a common theme in Sanderson novels. Anyway, in this cataclysm, men and women with supernatural powers known as the Knights Radiant battled creatures known as the Void Bringers. Then the Knights Radiant suddenly vanished, but left behind their magic weapons and armor known as Shard Blades and Shard Plate. They vanished allegedly because the Voidbringers were defeated, but of course, things aren't that simple when a new Knight Radiant is chosen. And as the story unfolds, it really is like an onion. There's layers on layers of history, a complex magic system, of course, other dimensions, godlike entities, and on and on. Now, each book in this series is over 1,000 pages, and it is epic in every sense you can imagine. Also, Sanderson writes in what he calls his Cosmere universe. Apparently, every book he writes is somehow connected to a hidden storyline. But frankly, I don't really care about that. But some people find it interesting, and you can Google around and find out more on that if you're interested. Now, obviously, the Stormlight Archives is a big commitment to read. If you've never read Sanderson before, I don't suggest this be the first series you jump into. I'd strongly suggest the Mistborn trilogy, the first Mistborn trilogy, as a good introduction to Sanderson. And if, and only if, you really enjoy Mistborn, should you consider starting the Stormlight Archive. At least that's my suggestion. It's just a suggestion. Feel free to ignore me like everyone else. Okay, from here on out, I'm going to be talking about Rhythm of War, assuming you've already read the first 3 books, but honestly, even if you haven't, you'll probably forget everything I say in this video by the time you get to book 4. So for those who haven't read any of the Stormlight books, feel free to continue watching or not. I'm not your mother. First off, if you are like me and are reading Stormlight as it's published, it's been 3 years.
3 years
since you've read Oathbringer, the previous book. So do yourself a favor and find a synopsis online to refresh yourself on what's happened thus far, even if it's just Wikipedia. You'll save yourself a lot of and what and Who was that? Now, I didn't do that, and it took me a good while to really get back into the rhythm of the story. So let's talk about Sanderson's writing, especially in this novel. Sanderson describes himself as a clear window writer, meaning he doesn't want his prose to get in the way of the story, as opposed to writers who write ornately or with purple prose. So this makes him really easy to read. He also, in my opinion, is a master story crafter, which means he really knows how to structure the story, which I find really makes his writing pleasant to read. Thus, now knowing that this is the 4th book in a 5-book story arc, I was curious how depressing the 4th book was going to be. So let me explain. If we break down a 5-stage story, the first stage or first act is the complication, which in this case was the Way of Kings, and we are introduced to the characters, we are introduced to the world and the setting, and we are introduced to the main complication or challenge. In this case, the Knight Radiants are being recruited once again, probably to face some big enemy. Now, the last book would of course be the resolution, which will be the 5th book, the next book that he writes, and we can deduce that that will probably be the Knights Radiant somehow defeating or overcoming the enemy or the threat the enemy poses. Now, the apex, not necessarily the climax, but the apex of the story would be the 3rd book, Oathbringer. Here we can expect the heroes look like they're going to win. And the 2nd stage, book 2, Words of Radiance, is where the conflict and action builds. So where does this leave us with book 4, Rhythm of War, sandwiched between the apex of the story and the resolution? Now, normally in a 5-stage story, the 4th one would contain the climax, but that would sort of give the game away. The climax is obviously going to happen in the 5th book. So for the 4th book, we can assume that it will be the darkness before the storm, when events go tits up and you think all hope is lost, although there should be a glimmer of hope. Now think about the end of the Twin Towers in Lord of the Rings. Frodo is presumed dead, and Sam takes the ring and thus takes the burden, but there's a glimmer of hope that Frodo isn't truly dead. But, oh my gosh, he's been taken by orcs. Now, when we look at a 5-book series, and I've been assuming it would end like most 2nd books in a trilogy, and generally that means things are going to be bleak. So I was kind of cringing on how Rhythm of War was going to end. Now, by the way, the 5-stage story structure I rely on is using the John Franklin method, not the traditional 5-act play structure. Now, why do I think Sanderson follows the 5-stage story structure? Well, every Stormlight book is divided into 5 parts, and each part pretty much follows the stages I just outlined. So it is only logical that Sanderson would divide his 5-book series accordingly. Anyway, my point is Sanderson bucked what I was expecting and ended the book in a manner that wasn't complete doom and gloom. There was a little bit of doom and gloom, but not complete doom and gloom. Now, what did I not like about his writing? The book is just so damn long. It feels as though he could cut some parts out, like the interludes. Between each part, there's suddenly interludes of minor characters or characters you've never met before, and it's easy to forget the interludes completely as you read. So what's the point of them? I don't know. But Sanderson started with the interludes in every book, so it's tradition now. So I guess we can expect it going forward. I will say for Rhythm of War, for the most part, the interlude POV characters were at least integral to the main plot. Not all of them, but most of them. Now, the other thing that drives me a little batty were the flashbacks. I understand why he had them where they were to inform of what was happening in the present, but they continued deep into the climax of the story. So if there's a rhythm of story, I kept feeling as though each time a flashback chapter came up, that the pacing of the story
hit a brick wall.
I'm reading along, the action is picking up, I'm really invested, I really want to know what happens next, and then bang! We're 5 years ago in the past to catch up on a subplot. Now, I do like the little quotes at the beginning of the chapter, which strongly reminded me of the Dune series, since I read Dune in the same month. Now, tell me those chapter snippets weren't inspired by Dune. Also, there is some amazing artwork sprinkled throughout the book, if you're interested in that kind of thing. Let's talk characters. We have the same cast of main characters: Dalinar, who is now the bondsmith to lead the fight; Navani, who is Dalinar's wife, who was the ex-wife of the king, who was his brother. But she is a genius at Artifabrian, which is creating magical artifacts. And she has a daughter, Jasna, who is queen of Alethkar. And she is one of my favorite characters, and we didn't see enough of her, and I hope there's more of her in the last book. Then there is Shallan, the woman with split personalities, and Kaladin, who is the first human who was chosen to be a Knight Radiant. Now, among these characters, a lot of focus was on Kaladin and Shallan, and they go through it. You remember I mentioned that things have to get pretty dark before there's hope when you look at this story structure. Well, be prepared to wanting to slap the crap out of Kaladin and Shallan. Then there's also a focus on the character of Venli, the Parsh woman, the non-human, who rediscovered all the forms of her people and brought back the Voidbringers. Her POV chapters are really interesting, seeing things from the enemy camp's perspective, and she has a pretty good story arc, if it wasn't for the flashbacks. Now let's talk about the magic system. Can we just give Sanderson the crown of king of magic systems? You can't help reading any of his books and thinking, oh, the magic system would be a great video game or a role-playing game or something like that. Now here, the Knights Radiant bond with Spren, which are entities that live in an alternate dimension but kind of exist on the real-world dimension. And the type of Spren determines the type of powers of the Knight Radiant. Now there are apparently 10 types of Knights Radiant, but thankfully maybe only half of them are connected somehow to the main characters in the book, and most of them are Windrunners and Edge Dancers, and it's easy to get a handle on those. But even how complicated the system is, we still don't know how it completely works, and we're at book 4 of 5. Now granted, we find out a lot about the Spren and how magic works in Rhythm of War, but I'm amazed there are even questions left. What about the world building? I just want to mention how amazing the world building is. The world of Roshar is completely alien, and not something you see often in fantasy novels. It is much more common in science fiction world building, where life forms develop and evolve differently on alien planets rather than on Earth. And ironically, Rhythm of War has a sort of pseudo-science fiction element to it that crops up from time to time. Imagine a world where all the water and rain is thick with calcium or minerals and forms thin shells every time it rains, and stalagmites form on roofs and whatnot like icicles in the wintertime. And of course, the Spren are fascinating creatures that live in a parallel dimension or universe or plane of existence that correspond to emotions and feelings that also live in the real world. So every emotion you have attracts these creatures. Everything together creates a truly alien and unique world, where humans really are the strangers in a strange land. Of course, I give this book my blessing. If you have been a big fan of the first 3 books, there's absolutely no reason not to read Rhythm of War. Sanderson maintains his excellent quality and grand master storytelling. I cannot wait for book 5 to come out and see how it all ends, but we'll probably have to wait another 3 years to find out. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.